Hello, I'm Hannah Donat with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. Che enjoys bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnerships, calls, webinars, science serves, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to today's Che EDC Strategies Partnership webinar, which is titled, Do Chemicals in Plastic Consumer Products Contribute to Obesity? Our moderator today is Sharyle Patton, Director of Commonweal's Biomonitoring Resource Center. We will leave time following the speaker's presentation for a brief Q&A session. You may type in questions through the Q&A feature available on the menu bar at the top of your window at any point during the presentation. For those of you who called in on the phone, we have posted slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download these by going to healthandenvironment.org. Please scroll to the bottom of the page and select today's webinar. On the webinar page is a link to the slides. Everyone on the webinar right now is muted with the exception of our moderator and our speaker. This webinar is scheduled to last for 30 minutes and is being recorded for our call and webinar archive. So with that, I'll turn things over to you, Sharyle.
Thanks a lot, Hannah, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our presenter today is Dr. Martin Wagner. He's an associate professor for environmental toxicology at the Norwegian University for Science and Technology. His main research interest is in the impacts of plastic pollution and plastic chemicals on ecosystems and human health. The framing concept of the Wagner Lab is bioanalytical toxicology. Martin works at the interface of ecology, toxicology, and chemistry, combining in vitro, in vivo, mass spec approaches to characterize the total toxicity of complex samples. The example is leachates of plastic materials. His research group also applies non-target high-resolution mass spec and effect-directed chemical analysis to identify the compounds causing the observed toxicity. With this approach, he aims at contributing to a more holistic understanding of human and environmental exposomes. Today, he'll be discussing adipogenic activity of chemicals used in plastic consumer products. So everyone, great pleasure to introduce to you Martin Wagner. Oh, Martin, go ahead.
Thank you, Sharyle, for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So good morning to the US, good evening from Norway, and wonderful to talk about plastic chemicals, disruption of metabolism, and the interlink to obesity. I want to really start highlighting the contribution by my co-authors, Johannes, Felicity, Åsa, and Lisa, did most of the work that went into the study, really. So I very much appreciate their contribution here. So I think like every presentation about plastic chemicals cannot avoid to talk about bisphenol A. So I'm going to talk about BPA as well. So most of the plastic products that we're looking at today, that we're finding on the shelves in our supermarkets, contain that kind of nice label that you're seeing over here. It's BPA free, it's non-toxic, and it's 100% safe. So that gives the public and also our decision makers the impression that we have accomplished the mission. So we've gotten rid of one very nasty chemical. Everything's great, everything's safe, so there's not a problem with plastics in a chemical sense. Obviously, this is wrong for two reasons. First of all, we're looking at what we call regrettable substitutions. So we have simply replaced bisphenol A with other bisphenols that are chemically and toxicologically very similar. But second of all, and that's what our research is really about, is that the fact that there's much more to plastics than just BPA. And to illustrate the fact, I'm showing you here what we call a forest of peak. So you're looking of peaks, you're looking at the chemical fingerprint of a plastic product. So in that case, it's a packaging made from bioplastics. And each of those tiny little trees or peaks that you're seeing is representing what we call a chemical feature, or for simplicity, just a compound. And in that particular case, we detected over 20,000 of those chemical features just in one single bioplastic product. So that really highlights the chemical complexity of the plastic products that we're using every day, tells us that BPA would just be one of the trees in that massive forest. And the problem with that kind of chemical complexity is really that we cannot assess the safety of those thousands of peaks and compounds that we're detecting in our plastic consumer products. And that's especially true given that most of those peaks remain unknown and unidentified chemicals. So I think we're really looking at an iceberg problem here. lot of talk today, these days, is about plastic additives. But the plastic additives really make up merely the tip of the icebergs. So these are part of what we call intentionally added substances, together with starting substances, monomers, for instance, such as BPA and catalysts. So those are all chemicals that we know we put into plastics, we are using in plastics. But then really the bulk of the iceberg, the belly, is the non-intentionally added substances. So these are impurities in the starting materials and in the additives, but also reaction byproducts that are formed during the manufacture of plastics, during the polymerization, and then eventually degradation products of the polymer once we're using them and we're discarding them. So in our research, we take an approach or take a hit on that iceberg problem using what we call non-target chemical analysis. So we use high-resolution mass spectrometry to look at this chemical fingerprints I've been showing you before, to look at all the chemicals that we can detect in plastic products. And we combine that approach with in vitro screening to look at the toxicity of the mixture of chemicals that is present in one plastic product. So we are looking for toxic effects for all kinds of endpoints, really here integrating mixture toxicity, but also covering the effects of the so far unknown plastic chemicals. And in the study that I'm going to talk about today, we turned that approach towards the question whether so-called metabolism-disrupting chemicals are present in plastics. So much similar to endocrine-disrupting chemicals, these are synthetic compounds that interfere with like the physiology, with the metabolic processes in the human body, and thereby can be linked to the problem of overweight and the obesity pandemic. And there's actually quite solid evidence for certain plastic chemicals, again, BPA and certain phthalates, that links those chemicals in animal models, but also in some epidemiological studies to the obesity pandemic. So what we've been doing in that study is we just went to the supermarkets, we purchased 34 everyday plastic products, covering what we call commodity plastics. So we try to cover the polymer types that most of our plastic materials are made from. A lot of these products were food contact materials, food contact articles, plastic packaging, basically. But to get like other polymers that are not used in food contact, we also purchased shower slippers, for instance, that are made from polyurethanes or PVC floor covering. We extracted those products using solvent to get out all of the chemicals that would be present in a particular product. And then we applied non-target high-resolution mass spec to do the chemical fingerprinting to characterize the chemical composition of those samples. And in parallel, we looked at a process that we call adipogenesis. So we used precursor cells or fat cells, so-called pre-adipocytes, and we exposed them to those mixtures of plastic chemicals coming from the 34 products. And then we performed high content imaging to see how these precursor cells would develop into full-grown adipocytes, fat cells, to look at how much fats, how many lipids they would accumulate, and how the morphology of these cells would look like after exposure to the mixture of plastic chemicals. And to dive right in, I'm showing you microscopic images of the fat cells. So what you're seeing over here is, these precursor cells, right, in the controls. And in these examples, we expose the cells to a polypropylene candy packaging over here and a placemat chemicals from a placemat made from PVC. But you can easily see is that those cells exposed to the plastic chemicals start to accumulate lipids, shown in red over here. But also if you expose them to higher concentrations of plastic chemicals, in that case, coming from 3 milligrams of plastic, you see that they start to proliferate. So they form many more adipocytes compared to the controls where there's hardly any differentiation. So a more quantitative look at these adipogenic activities we looked at is shown over here. Overall, we found that 1/3 of the plastic products that we looked at contained chemicals that induce adipogenesis. So you see here, it's plastics products made from low density polyethylene, polystyrene, polypropylene, And most of the PVC and polyurethane products we looked at induced quite a strong proliferation of these fat cells and also induced a differentiation into full-grown adipocytes over there. So plastic products contain chemicals that induce these adipogenic effects. We also looked into whether these effects would result in a higher accumulation of lipids over here. And indeed, we saw that cells exposed to those plastic extracts had many more lipid droplets in them compared to controls. And in some cases, these responses were quite potent. So you see over here, the dotted line is the maximum effect that we have observed for a reference compound that we used, rosiglitazone, a quite potent metabolism-disrupting chemical, pharmaceutical. And some of the plastic extracts induce stronger effects than that pharmaceutical. So the responses are quite potent. Now, the major player that's involved in adipogenesis is thought to be a certain cellular receptor called PPAR gamma. So chemicals, the idea is, would activate that receptor, and downstream that would trigger proliferation and differentiation into fat cells. So we screened our plastic extracts for PPAR gamma activity. And interestingly and strikingly, we found that only 2 of the plastic samples actually activated that receptor. 1 PVC sample and 1 polystyrene sample activated PPAR gamma and also induced a strong adipogenic effect. In contrast, the majority of our plastic samples that were adipogenic did not activate PPAR gamma. So that shows us that there must be another mechanism involved into the adipogenic effects that we observed. And because like PPAR gamma activation is like the most common screening tool to look for metabolism disrupting chemicals, we believe that we really need to look into other types of mechanisms by which chemicals would force cells to become fat cells. Looking at the number of chemicals or chemical features that we detected in our samples, overall we found more than 55,000 chemical features across all samples. And again, you see, like it's the PVC and polyurethane samples that contain very, very many chemical features, more than 6,000 in case of that sample over here. In contrast, you see polyethylene terephthalate, PET, and high-density polyethylene contains less features, typically 100 to 500 features. But you also see that the chemical composition, the number of features, varies very much with per sample. The important bit of information is hidden here in the small black bars. And that was the compounds that we were actually able to identify using different kind of approaches. So typically we can identify less than 10% of all the features that we find in one plastic samples. And that tells us that the vast majority of plastic chemicals remains unidentified, unknown, and thus really has never been looked at or assessed for their health effects. Nonetheless, out of those identified chemicals, 860 in total, we cross-referenced that list of detected compounds, identified compounds, with a list of known metabolism-disrupting chemicals. And it turns out that plastics actually contain at least 11 known MDCs, metabolism-disrupting chemicals, including 4 phthalates used as plasticizers and 6 organophosphates probably used as flame retardants. So the phthalates here we detected were very specifically found, especially in the PVC floor covering and another PVC product. That's where they're used as plasticizers mainly. We didn't detect them in any other samples. In contrast to that, the organophosphate compounds were much more prevalent. So this is a compound here that's called TPP, triphenyl phosphate, that we detected in quite many samples, 17 in total. So there's known metabolism disrupting chemicals in our plastic samples. However, when we cross-reference the levels of these chemicals with the observed activity, it really didn't add up. So a lot of the active samples didn't contain any known metabolism disrupting compound. So that's why we believe that it's rather unknown compounds that are causing the adipogenic effects that we observed. So in a very nutshell, 1/3 of the products that we looked at contain metabolism-disrupting compounds that induce quite strong adipogenic responses. And given that adipogenesis is like the key cellular process that results or leads to the development of overweight and obesity later in life, we believe that plastics may be an underestimated environmental factor that contributes to the obesity pandemic. And there's a big may in that statement, because of course we would need to better understand the actual human exposure to all these plastic chemicals. And we would need to know about toxicokinetics, of course, elimination, metabolism, and we would need to understand the in vivo effects of those complex mixtures of plastic chemicals. The effects we observe were not mediated via p-per gamma, so the main mechanism that's currently thought of being involved in adipogenesis and then overweight and obesity. So other mechanisms must contribute here. And I think we really need to figure out what those mechanisms are to effectively screen for metabolism disrupting chemicals and more comprehensively screen for those compounds in the future. We've shown that the plastics we looked at are chemically very complex with over 55,000 features across the 34 plastic products. And that just highlights yet another time how vast the universe of plastic chemicals is, and that we're dealing with mostly uncharacterized, unidentified, and unassessed chemicals. Yet there were 11 known metabolism disrupting chemicals present in plastics already. As I said before, we believe that those are not the major cause of the adipogenic effects that we observed. So we really need to go out for the hunt for those unidentified chemicals there. So the overall picture that emerges from our study, in addition to our previous work, really presents us with that chemical complexity challenge of plastics. So how can we make sure that thousands to 10,000 of plastic chemicals present in one individual product can be assessed for their safety? So what are the ways forward here? I think the first step should really be that we acknowledge that plastics, as well as other materials, cannot be considered safe given the huge number of unknown chemicals they contain that have never been analyzed, have never been tested for toxicity, have never been assessed. So I think one step forward would be to enforce a larger transparency about the chemical composition of plastics. Why should we spend public money and a lot of many years and resources on research figuring out what these chemicals are when the producers actually at least know which intentionally added chemicals they're using? As much as I love to do this research, I think it's much more efficient to promote transparency there. Then we need to abandon this idea of assessing safety of individual chemicals. Indeed, we need to look at the safety and the hazards of all chemicals present in the plastic product. And the approach that I've been presenting here using in vitro screening to look at the toxicity of all the chemicals that is present or leaching or released by a plastic product, I think is an important step forward in that. So why can't we just screen plastic products for their in vitro toxicity and screen out those that are non-toxic? And finally, and that's probably the biggest task at hand, we really need to encourage a massive redesign of the plastic materials and products we are using. And I think one guiding principle for do so would be chemical simplicity. So why is it that an individual plastic bottle needs to contain hundreds of unknown chemicals? Why can't we design better materials and products that contain only a handful of well-characterized and hence safe chemicals? I think that's what we really need to push for, especially on our way to circularity, right? Because circling all these toxic chemicals won't really solve the issue here. So all these things are really needed, and I'm coming to an end here, looking forward to the questions, to really make that statement true. The best things in life come in cellophane or other plastics DuPont ad from the 1950s. Thanks for listening. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And now we can move into some questions that may have come up. Hannah, I don't see any questions on my computer. Do you? Am I not looking at the right place?
It just came up by
Here's
Linda.
one. Oh, I see it. Okay. Have you considered whether adipogenesis is being mediated, at least in part, by sex hormone disruption, perhaps via estrogen receptor signaling?
Mm. So there's a crosstalk of p-PAC gamma to very many other receptors, including hormone receptors, right? So RXR is one of the receptors that it massively crosstalks with, and we haven't looked into the activation, at least not in the published work, of RXR by our plastic chemicals. However, we have looked at estrogen receptor and also androgen receptor. And indeed, we find that plastic chemicals activate the estrogen receptor, and they also antagonize the androgen receptor. So what we're showing in other papers and other publications is indeed that there's endocrine disrupting chemicals present in plastic that are estrogenic or anti-androgenic. And a similar picture emerges kind of in such that it's often PVC and polyurethane products that contain these kind of chemicals. But it's also other chemicals. So polystyrene products, for example, contain estrogens. That's unpublished work that we've recently been doing. So, and that I think just highlights that there is like kind of a plethora of toxicological responses that those plastic chemicals trigger, including endocrine disruption. We believe that the mechanism for the adipogenesis that we observe might be related to inflammation. Again, unpublished work, something that we're looking into at the moment. So hope to come up with updates later.
Okay. We have many questions here, Martin. So if we don't get through to all of them for you, we'll make sure that we send you these questions and perhaps you can address them later on. So how do these exposures affect adults? I think someone is thinking about endocrine disruptors being more powerful for developing fetus or during critical times of development throughout the lifespan. So someone is asking a question, do these chemicals encourage obesity in adults?
So that's a statement that we cannot really make based on the research that we are doing, right? So remember, we're looking at cellular level effects. We're looking at fat cells that we culture in culture dishes. That's all done in vitro. So of course, what we would need to do is follow up that work with in vivo studies, which we haven't done. But of course, I think there's quite striking evidence for bisphenol A in certain phthalates in animal models and rodents. These chemicals induce obesity. So I think at least that case can be made, but like I cannot kind of conclude for like all the unknown chemicals and the mixtures that we look at. I think exposures could be expected to be widespread given like just the close contact we are in with plastics on a daily basis. However, it really depends on like which chemicals would actually be released by the plastic products, right? Keep in mind, we extracted all chemicals from our products. That's a very harsh procedure. I'm seeing another question about that as well. So like now the interesting question would be how many chemicals can actually like exit those products, can migrate, can leach, can be volatilized so that humans would actually be exposed to. And in another study that we recently published last year, I think in Environmental Science and Technology, we actually showed that quite many of those chemicals that are in a plastic product will migrate into water. And that's kind of a surrogate simulating a migration to foodstuff for food packaging, for instance. So we show that up to 80% of the chemical features that we detect in plastic actually leach. So that's quite a high number, I must say. And that those leachates into water also induce toxicity in vitro. So there's quite a potential there for humans being exposed to those chemicals. But of course, much more work is needed on the exposure side of things.
Mm-hmm. Given the ubiquity of microplastics and the obesogenic, adipogenic effects of plastics and their chemical additives, do you think microplastics specifically warrant special concern, especially seeing there's a growing evidence that we're being exposed to microplastic, they've been detected in human lung, placenta, and so on?
Well, of course, there's like a strong interconnection between plastic chemicals, nano and microplastics, right? Because at the end, it's just plastic products releasing both particles as well as chemicals. So I think that's what we need to keep in mind. And that's why we need to think about like hazards and risks from plastics, both in terms of plastic particles as well as in plastic chemicals. I think like the endocrine disrupting effects and the obesogenic or adipogenic effects that we are looking at here are caused by the chemicals and not by the particles. Indeed, I think like the major mechanism that we look at in terms of nano and microplastics would be inflammation. So there's quite abundant literature showing that microplastics and nanoplastics trigger inflammation. Recent paper published by our group on that topic as well. So I think like from a mechanistic point of view, I would rather think that like the endocrine disrupting and metabolism disrupting effects we're looking at could be attributed to the chemicals and would not be related to the microplastics. But that is not to say that nano microplastics would not have toxicological effects. As I said, inflammation, for instance.
You made several recommendations about how we might move forward to get these chemicals regulated, including a very basic one about transparency, what's being added and what is unintentionally present in plastics. What's the biggest barrier that you think exists currently to moving forward on your recommendations in terms of creating regulations or changing to policies that advocate for simpler plastics? What is the biggest barrier that you think exists now?
Well, I think in terms of transparency, the major problem is like trade secrets, right? So, I mean, the formulations of plastic products are kept secret by the manufacturers just because of competition. And I think that's something that we need to address really, because after all, it's the manufacturer's responsibility to sell us plastic products that are safe, right? And if they don't disclose the chemical composition of their products, how can we know that these products are chemically safe? So I think it's imperative to really enforce transparency over there. And I think that might help also in the redesign of materials, because what we're seeing in our research is often that you take, for instance, a yogurt cup made from polystyrene, you find like one yogurt cup that has a lot of chemicals and induces a lot of toxicity, whereas another yogurt cup by another manufacturer does not. So I think transparency here could also help the manufacturers and figure out better, safer designs of their polymers. But obviously, of course, I think the major roadblocks for making plastics safer is clearly lobbyism and lack of awareness. I still believe that many policymakers actually think like we don't really have a problem over there because we fixed the BPA problem, we've gotten rid of phthalates in baby toys, etc. So I think it's not very high on the agenda, whereas like everybody's like kind of aware of the microplastics and plastic pollution problem. So I think it's important to remind them that plastic pollution and microplastics has the strong link to plastic chemicals as well. So we need to tackle both. And if we really want to make circularity for plastics happen, we need to get rid of the toxics in plastics, right? Because as I said before, we will start cycling all those toxic chemicals. In each cycle, you will add new chemicals. So we're just building up this kind of legacy of toxic chemicals we don't even know the name of. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed urgently.
And we're coming to the end of our time, but let's do one more question, Hannah, that's all right. There has been an idea being circulated that globally we have reached a threshold into how many chemicals can exist and be used, be ubiquitous, be ever present, that the global will no longer be able to sustain good ecosystem and human health. We've just reached the tipping point. What do you think about this idea?
Well, I think like the planetary boundaries for chemicals, and I'm very fond and very much excited about the recent publication on that. I think the planetary boundaries for chemicals has actually been crossed because of our inability to assess all those chemicals that we are using every day, right? And our work just provides an insight into like a small tiny case of plastic products here, and we're seeing tens of thousands of chemicals that are unknown and unassessed, right? So I think like the argument of humanity being unable to assess the materials and the chemicals that we have created makes a compelling argument that we're at least in a danger zone, because it's just simply unknown how safe or how not safe, unsafe the chemicals that we're using every day are. So I think there's a compelling argument in this kind of planetary boundary framework to be made that we're simply just not able to know what the consequences of all the plastic, of all the chemicals and materials are that we have made. So I think I wouldn't call it a tipping point, because the planetary boundary is like still kind of a bit away from that tipping point. But I think it's really a call for caution about the lack of chemical safety of all the chemicals that we're using.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. And thank you very much for your excellent presentation. We all are very excited about the research you are doing and look forward to your next steps. And thank you so much for this. I'll turn this back now to Hannah. And thank you again, Martin.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Martin and Sharyle. We're approaching the end of today's webinar. A video recording will be available on CHE's website soon, and tomorrow you'll receive an email containing a link to the video. The next CHE Partnership webinar will take place on May 12th and is titled Personal Care Products Use and Chemical Exposure Among Black, Latina, and Vietnamese Women in California, Findings from the Capable Project. To learn more and to RSVP, please visit our website at healthandenvironment.org. If you are new to CHE and would like to stay updated about upcoming events or more, please sign up to receive our newsletter by selecting the Join Us tab at the top of any page on our website at healthandenvironment.org. Additionally, if you appreciate these CHE Partnership webinars bringing you the latest environmental research for free, we encourage you to support CHE's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. Again, our website is healthandenvironment.org. With that, I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Wagner, for taking time to present today, and to you, Sharyle, for your excellent moderation. Thank you so much for joining us. We're wishing all much health and wellness. Take care.